Emily Jacobs vanished without a trace after an affair with a married man, Thomas Sullivan. What seemed like a simple case of heartbreak soon unraveled into a chilling mystery, one that would reveal the darkest secrets of a man desperate to cover his tracks. As the truth slowly emerged, Emily's disappearance became something much more sinister, an affair turned deadly, and a husband willing to do anything to hide his guilt. In a quiet suburban town, life seemed to follow a predictable rhythm. The houses were neat, the lawns meticulously trimmed, and the residents went about their daily routines, unaware of the dark secret brewing beneath the surface. Emily Jacobs, a 28-year-old woman, had lived here for most of her life. She worked as a marketing assistant at a local company, a job she found satisfying but not particularly exciting. Her life, though seemingly ordinary, was about to take a turn she never saw coming. Emily had always been a romantic at heart. She believed in the idea of soulmates, in the magic of love at first sight. Her relationships, though brief, were intense, and she always threw herself into them wholeheartedly. When she met Thomas Sullivan at a local bookstore one rainy afternoon, she was instantly drawn to him. He was charming, well-spoken, and strikingly handsome. His easy smile and deep laugh made her feel special in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. Thomas, 35 years old, was a married man with 2 young children. His life appeared perfect on the surface. He had a stable job in finance, a beautiful home, and a loving wife, Laura. However, beneath that picture of perfection, something was missing. Over the years, his marriage had become stagnant. He no longer felt the same spark he had once shared with Laura. They had become more like roommates than lovers, and he began to crave excitement and passion again. That's when he met Emily. What started as a casual conversation at the bookstore quickly turned into a series of secret meetings. Emily didn't know much about Thomas's life at first. She only knew that he was different from the other men she had dated. Older, more experienced, and more intriguing. He told her stories about his job, his family, and his travels. Emily, captivated by his attention, found herself falling for him. She believed he was the man who would make her feel alive again. For Thomas, Emily became an escape. She was young, free-spirited, and full of life. Everything he felt was missing from his own marriage. They began to meet in secret, often at Emily's apartment after work or in remote, quiet spots around town. Their connection was electric, and the passion they shared was undeniable. Thomas would tell her how much he loved their time together, how it made him feel young again, and how his marriage had become nothing more than a routine. Emily, in return, reveled in the attention and affection Thomas gave her. At first, Emily didn't question the fact that Thomas was married. He had reassured her that his marriage was over, that he wasn't happy with Laura. But as time passed, doubts began to creep into her mind. She saw how protective Thomas was of his phone, how he occasionally mentioned his wife in passing, but always in a way that made her feel like she was an afterthought. Still, Emily pushed the thoughts aside. She wanted to believe in the fairy tale, but life has a way of revealing truths at the most inconvenient times. One evening, as they were leaving a local restaurant after dinner, Emily noticed Thomas's unease. He seemed distracted, checking his phone more frequently than usual, glancing over his shoulder as though he was afraid someone might see them together. Emily, though, was too wrapped up in the allure of their affair to let it bother her. She didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of the end. Something was about to shatter their secret world, and Emily had no idea just how. Close she was to losing everything. As days passed, Thomas became more distant. His texts were shorter, his phone calls less frequent, and when they met, he seemed preoccupied. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but she didn't dare ask him directly. What if she was overthinking it? What if he was just busy with work? She didn't want to appear insecure or needy. But deep down she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that things were about to unravel. And she was right. The storm was coming, and it would change everything. Laura Sullivan had always been a perceptive woman, though she never considered herself overly suspicious. She had spent years building a life with Thomas, her husband, and raising their 2 children in the suburban home they had bought right after they got married. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Their kids were healthy and happy, their home was cozy, and Thomas had a successful career that kept them financially secure. But as the years passed, something began to shift. It started subtly. Thomas, once the attentive and loving husband, began to pull away. He would come home later than usual, sometimes with no explanation at all, and when he was home, he was distant. He would sit in front of the TV for hours, lost in his thoughts, while Laura took care of the household responsibilities and their children. She couldn't pinpoint when it started, but the distance between them had grown so gradually that she hadn't noticed it at first. There were times when she thought back to when they had met, remembering how he used to make her feel like the only woman in the world. Now, it seemed like the magic had long since faded. At first, Laura attributed his behavior to the pressures of work and family life, but as weeks turned into months, her gut told her that something more was at play. The occasional late nights, the secretive glances at his phone, and his increasing irritability left her feeling uneasy. Still, she chose to ignore her instincts, hoping that this phase would pass. But the more she tried to push it out of her mind, the more the doubts grew. Then, one evening, after a particularly cold and quiet dinner, Laura found herself scrolling through the contacts on their shared phone plan. It was a harmless task, something she did regularly to check up on the kids' phone usage when she noticed something unusual. There was a number she didn't recognize, but it had been calling and texting Thomas late into the night. At first, she thought it might be work-related, but something about it felt off. She told herself it was nothing, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. The next day, while Thomas was at work, Laura decided to take a closer look. She knew it wasn't entirely fair, but she couldn't help herself. Her heart pounded as she unlocked his phone and began sifting through his messages. Her hands trembled when she came across a string of text conversations that confirmed her worst fears. The messages were intimate, flirtatious, and filled with longing. They weren't from a colleague or a friend. No, these texts were from someone else. A woman. Emily. The more Laura read, the more her stomach twisted. The messages spoke of late-night rendezvous, plans to meet again, and promises of passion. Her heart shattered as she realized the truth. Thomas had been having an affair. The man she had loved for years, the father of her children, had been betraying her in the most painful way imaginable. A mix of anger, hurt, and confusion flooded her. How could he do this to her? How long had this been going on? She thought back to all the times she had given him the benefit of the doubt, all the moments when she had dismissed her instincts. Now the truth was in front of her, and it was undeniable. Laura's initial reaction was to confront him immediately, but she stopped herself. She knew she needed to be strategic. She couldn't just let him off the hook without knowing everything. So, she decided to investigate further. She began following Thomas in secret, watching his every move when he left the house. She told herself that she was doing it for the sake of their family, but in reality, it was about gathering evidence. She needed to know how far this affair had gone. Days passed, and the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. She tracked his movements, visited places he had mentioned in passing, and began to piece together a story of infidelity and lies. With every new discovery, Laura's anger grew, but so did her determination to get the truth. She would confront him, yes, but on her own terms. And when she did, there would be no turning back. By the time Laura knew everything she needed to know, the affair was no longer just an emotional betrayal. It had become a full-blown crisis, and the storm that was about to hit their home would change their lives forever. The day Laura decided to confront Thomas, she knew it couldn't wait any longer. The secret she had discovered, his affair with Emily, had consumed her thoughts for days. She had meticulously gathered evidence, tracking his movements, looking for any remaining signs of honesty in a man who had deceived her in the worst possible way. But now, everything had reached a breaking point. She could no longer ignore the gut-wrenching pain and betrayal that had been eating away at her. It was time to face him. That evening, as the sun set and their children settled into bed, Laura knew it was the moment. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of floorboards. Thomas had been unusually distant all week, and Laura couldn't help but feel that he was bracing for the inevitable. She'd seen how uneasy he had become whenever she asked him simple questions, his responses short and defensive. But she had no idea how he would react when confronted with the full truth. She called him to the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. Her fingers were cold as she clutched the stack of printed text messages she had uncovered. She'd spent hours reading them, each word more painful than the last, but she knew it was necessary to have proof. When Thomas entered the room, he was immediately struck by the serious, almost suffocating atmosphere. Laura didn't waste any time. She calmly placed the printed messages on the coffee table and sat back, her eyes never leaving his. Thomas froze for a moment, his face draining of color as his eyes darted to the texts on the table. It was as though the air in the room shifted. He knew immediately what it meant. For a second, Laura saw a flicker of panic in his eyes, quick, fleeting. But it was enough. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words seemed to falter on his tongue. She could tell he was trying to think of something, anything, to defend himself, but in that moment, Laura felt the overwhelming weight of years of silence and lies between them. "How long?" she asked, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "How long has this been going on, Thomas?" He shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He took a deep breath, his voice shaky. "Laura, I didn't mean for it to happen. You have to understand." "No," Laura interrupted, her voice cutting through the air with an edge she didn't know she had. "I don't want excuses, I want the truth. You were with her, weren't you? You've been seeing her behind my back all this time." The silence between them was thick, suffocating. Finally, Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and regret. "Yes," he admitted softly. "But it wasn't what you think. It wasn't like that at first. It started out small, just a few texts here and there. And then, I don't know, we just connected. But I never meant to hurt you. Laura's blood boiled as she fought to keep her composure. You didn't mean to hurt me, she echoed, her voice trembling now. You didn't mean to hurt me? You've been lying to me for months, hiding this whole other life. You've been sneaking around, lying to my face, and you never thought for 1 second that you might be hurting me. That's the worst part, Thomas. You never thought about me. Not once. Thomas reached out to her, his face twisted with sorrow. Laura, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you, I swear. I was confused and I got caught up in something that spiraled out of control. I never wanted to lose you. You mean everything to me. But Laura didn't want his apologies. She didn't want the excuses or the half-hearted attempts at reconciliation. She had heard them all before, too many times. His words were hollow, empty promises that meant nothing now. The trust they had built over years of marriage had been shattered in an instant, and there was no going back. You've already lost me, she said, her voice breaking slightly. You lost me the moment you chose her over us. The finality in her words hit him harder than anything else. He stood there, helpless, watching her as she made her decision. There was nothing he could say or do to undo the damage he had caused. The life they had built together was unraveling, and the worst part was that it was all his doing. For a moment, there was silence again, but this time it was different. It wasn't filled with unspoken emotions or suppressed anger. It was the silence of an ending, of a relationship that had reached its breaking point. Laura stood up, her heart heavy with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. She had confronted him with the truth, and now there was no turning back. I want you to leave, she said softly, her voice devoid of any warmth. I need you to go, and don't come back until you figure out what you want, because I can't live in this lie anymore. Thomas didn't say a word. His face crumbled, but he didn't fight her. He knew this was the end. The moment had come. The following days were a blur for Laura. The initial confrontation had left her emotionally drained, but now, faced with the reality of her broken marriage, she was consumed by a sense of deep, hollow emptiness. She spent hours in the house, walking from room to room, feeling like a stranger in her own home. Every corner of the house held a memory, every object a reminder of the life she had shared with Thomas. It felt like everything had been shattered, and she was left to pick up the pieces. Thomas left the house that night, and Laura didn't stop him. She couldn't bear to look at him anymore. The man she had loved, the man who had promised to be her partner through everything, was now a stranger. She didn't know what to feel anymore. Anger, sadness, betrayal, or something deeper, more painful. All she knew was that she needed time, space, and some semblance of clarity. But what happened next was beyond anything she could have imagined. The first night after Thomas left, Laura expected to hear from him. She imagined him calling, apologizing, trying to explain himself, but there was nothing. Days passed, and still there was no word from Thomas. The silence was deafening, and it only made her feel more isolated. Meanwhile, Emily, Thomas's lover, was nowhere to be found. Laura had hoped that after everything, Emily might reach out, if only to apologize or explain, but there was no sign of her either. Laura had tried searching for her online, looking for any trace of the woman who had torn her world apart. She found nothing. Emily's social media profiles were locked, and her phone number was no longer reachable. It was as though she had vanished. At first, Laura tried to tell herself that Emily had just moved on. Perhaps she had known all along that Thomas was not going to leave his family for her, and she had quietly slipped away. But the more Laura thought about it, the more suspicious it became. Emily didn't strike her as the type of woman who would simply fade into the background. If anything, she seemed driven, assertive, the kind of person who would demand closure, even if it came at the expense of hurting someone else. It wasn't long before Laura started to piece things together. She remembered how, just before Thomas left, his behavior had been erratic. He'd been acting paranoid, checking his phone constantly, and rushing out of the house as if trying to avoid something or someone. And then there was the most chilling detail. Emily's disappearance was eerily timed with the breakdown of Laura's marriage. It didn't sit right with her. It couldn't just be coincidence. Laura contacted the police, though at first they were dismissive. Emily was an adult, they said. She had every right to walk away, especially after a confrontation with a married man. But Laura refused to accept that answer. She knew something was wrong. She told the police about the strange timing of Emily's sudden absence, how she seemed to vanish without a trace, and how Thomas's behavior had been so odd in the days leading up to it. There were whispers, murmurs of something darker, but no one had concrete answers. It seemed like Emily had simply dropped off the grid, vanishing from the face of the earth. The authorities began looking into the case, but without any hard evidence, the investigation didn't move quickly. They reached out to Thomas, who denied any involvement in Emily's disappearance. He claimed he hadn't heard from her since the night Laura had confronted him, but his story seemed to unravel the more they dug into it. Thomas had been increasingly evasive, unable to explain where he had been or what he had been doing after he left the house. His calm demeanor, coupled with his inability to offer anything of substance, only made him appear more suspicious. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of Emily. But Laura couldn't stop herself from wondering if her husband knew more than he was letting on. She couldn't shake the thought that Thomas had been involved in something far darker than a simple affair. Something had happened to Emily, and as much as she hated to admit it, she had a sinking feeling that Thomas knew exactly what that something was. But no one was ready to confront him yet. The truth was still out of reach, but it was growing, closer with each passing day. And as Laura wrestled with her feelings of betrayal and grief, she knew that the answers she sought would come at a cost she couldn't yet understand. The silence around Emily's disappearance was deafening, and the closer Laura got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Weeks passed, but the investigation into Emily's disappearance showed little progress. Laura's frustration grew as she continued to live in a state of constant uncertainty. She had no answers, no closure, and every day she became more consumed by the growing realization that her life was spiraling further out of control. The house, once filled with laughter and comfort, now felt like a prison. She couldn't even find solace in the quiet anymore. Her mind replayed the painful memories of the affair, and the haunting thought that Emily might be gone forever never left her. The police had questioned Thomas several times, but each time his answers seemed rehearsed, too clean, too perfect. His denials were convincing, but his behavior was not. The more they questioned him, the more he seemed to retreat into himself, avoiding any direct involvement in the investigation. He stuck to the same story, that he hadn't heard from Emily since their last argument, and that he had no idea where she might be. But something in his demeanor, something in the way he seemed almost too detached, didn't sit right with the officers. They could sense there was more to the story, but without hard evidence they were powerless to pursue it further. Laura, however, couldn't accept this. She had lived with Thomas for too long to believe that he was truly innocent. Something had happened to Emily, and as much as she wanted to deny it, she couldn't shake the suspicion that Thomas had played a role in her disappearance. The timeline matched too perfectly, and the fact that Emily had vanished without a trace just days after the confrontation was no mere coincidence. One day, Laura took a bold step. She returned to the scene where Thomas had spent the last few hours with Emily before everything fell apart, the same restaurant where they had shared meals and whispered secrets. She needed to see if there was anything at all, that might give her a clue about Emily's disappearance. The restaurant was quiet, nearly empty, but as she sat at a table in the corner, she began to scan the room, her mind racing. The place was familiar, but it felt colder now, almost unrecognizable. Then she noticed something unusual, an envelope, carelessly left behind on the table. It wasn't large, but something about it stood out. She stood up and walked over to her pulse quickening as she picked it up. Inside, she found a single photograph. It was blurry, taken with a phone, but it was enough to make her blood run cold. It was a picture of Emily, looking terrified, her eyes wide and filled with panic, and behind her, unmistakably, was Thomas. The photograph was a shock, but it was the note that accompanied it that froze her in place. "You'll never find her. She's gone," it read, written in neat, careful handwriting that seemed too deliberate, too controlled. Laura's heart raced, and for the first time since Emily's disappearance, she felt like she was holding a piece of the puzzle that might finally make sense of everything. She immediately took the photograph to the police. Their reaction was swift, though not as hopeful as Laura had hoped. They still didn't have enough to make an arrest, but the photograph was undeniably significant. It placed Thomas at the scene, and it showed him in a way that made it clear he had been much more involved than he had let on. The officers finally began to pursue the lead with more urgency, and soon they found evidence that Thomas had made several strange, late-night trips to areas near where Emily was last seen. But the final blow came when the authorities discovered that Thomas had taken out a large life insurance policy, one that named him as the sole beneficiary, just weeks before Emily's disappearance. The realization sent shockwaves through the investigation. It wasn't just an affair, and it wasn't just a matter of betrayal. Thomas had been planning something much darker. The walls began to close in on him, and as the truth slowly came to light, it became clear that Thomas's involvement in Emily's disappearance wasn't just an accident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was deliberate, calculated, and cold. Laura had known all along that something was wrong, but now the depth of her husband's deception was unfathomable. As the authorities closed in on Thomas, he became more and more erratic, his once calm exterior unraveling. Laura, now desperate for closure, demanded answers. She wanted to know where Emily was, what had happened to her, and why it had to come to this. But Thomas remained silent, refusing to acknowledge the gravity of his actions until the truth was forced out of him. The investigation eventually led to the discovery of Emily's remains in a remote area, a place that Thomas had frequented, in the days after the affair had been exposed. The full extent of his betrayal was finally uncovered, and he was arrested, charged with the murder of Emily Jacobs.